Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Neil Howard, here on Health Professional Radio. Thank you so much for joining us once again. In this segment, going to have a conversation with Mr. Jim Omel. He's joining us on the program to talk about his participation in the INSIGHT-MM, or multiple myeloma study, of which he's also an author, and also to talk a bit about the benefits of real-world evidence with patients participating in trials in multiple myeloma. Welcome to the program, Jim. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Neil.
Well, a bit of background about yourself, and let's talk about this study in multiple myeloma.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I have a rich science background with degrees in both pharmacy and medicine. I was a family physician for 23 years before my diagnosis of multiple myeloma. I retired from practice after I had a stem cell transplant because it really isn't healthy. Your immune system just isn't the same once you've been exposed to some of the chemicals of transplantation. I became active in cancer research advocacy and patient education, and after several years of that, I was invited by Takeda to join their PLC, their Patient Leadership Council. And that actually led to another invitation from Takeda to join the steering committee of INSIGHT. It was formed back in 2016.
For our listeners who may not be familiar with multiple myeloma, explain briefly what it is and what causes it.
Multiple myeloma is basically a blood cancer, but it's so much more than that. It can form nests within bones, and it erodes those bones. It causes fractures. It produces a high protein, which can cause problems with kidneys. It will lead to anemia because these malignant plasma cells, are what they're called, they actually fill the bone marrow and weed out or crowd out other blood-forming elements such as red cells and platelets and white cells. So infections are a hallmark of myeloma. It can involve bones, particularly. Most patients present with bone pain. It is a blood cancer, but it's also a bone marrow cancer. It's also a cancer of the immune system itself. It's not curable. It is highly treatable, though. We have lots of good treatments that have come to us over the last few years.
Were you on those treatments prior to the transplant?
Actually, Neil, my myeloma goes back to 1997, and in those years, we didn't have these good treatments. I was treated with VAD, vincristine, adriamycin, dexamethasone, and I got about 2 years of remission from that, and then it came back again in 2000. I had an autologous stem cell transplant, and at that time, I actually decided to stop practice. I had relapses in 2006. I had another relapse in 2010. And these were treated with radiation. They were treated with some of the novel therapies, such as proteasome inhibitors and immune modulator drugs. So in my relapses, I had these good therapies, but initially I didn't. I had told my family my life expectancy was 3 years in 1997. And I've beaten all kinds of odds to be living with this cancer now for 22 years.
That brings a lot of hope, and you're bringing awareness and also talking about some of these results in this study. Let's talk about this INSIGHT-MM study. You're one of the authors of this study, right?
Yes, INSIGHT is a tremendous undertaking. We actually have enrolled 4,200 patients to this study. We just finished our accrual last month, Neil, in July. So it's a study that is observational. We do not give drugs. We don't suggest any doctors change their treatment. We just step back and observe these patients. So many patients receive treatments for their myeloma, and they wouldn't even be eligible to get those treatments if they were in a randomized clinical trial. But they need treatment. They need these drugs. How will they do? What kind of complications will they have? What kind of results will they have with various types of treatment? We observe these things, and it's the value of INSIGHT because it involves 15 countries, again, 4,200 patients. And how do they do if a treatment is given in one country, or perhaps if a drug's not even available in that country? What happens to those patients?
So you're observing the results of many different types of treatments, many different places, many different types of patients, and you're analyzing those results in order to, produce better patient outcomes as a result of this study. What are you observing? What do you think the future holds for multiple myeloma patients?
Well, that's a good question. The future really looks quite bright, Neil. Again, it is an incurable cancer, but we have so many good treatments that patients can expect to live much longer than they could when I was diagnosed. The future is bright. The treatments are many. We just need to get these treatments to patients. Interestingly, I just read an article last night about Latin America multiple myeloma patients and how they lag significantly behind the good results that we've had in the United States. And a good reason for that, Neil, is that they don't have these treatments. They're not available in Latin America. And some of them aren't even available in parts of Europe. So patients are not getting the improvement that they deserve, and it just doesn't seem fair that a patient should die early because of the happenstance of where they live. So if we can show governments, if we can show authorities that treatments that we have are making a difference, perhaps those authorities will allow these treatments to come into their countries, even though they are expensive treatments.
Are some of these treatments that you're observing in one country that is, say, closer to an underserved area as opposed to here in the United States or Latin America, maybe some of these countries that are closer globally, could they lend a hand, for lack of a better term, when it comes to accessibility for some of these treatments that are actually working?
I think the answer to that really comes down to each country's authorities, how they allow drugs in their country, how they allow export or import of treatments. And that's probably a country-by-country answer. But we can show that there are differences. There are differences in outcomes. In fact, we've already gotten some data that show that countries' drug availability and treatments are making a difference. Another thing about this trial that's interesting, Neil, is the fact that we tried to get a split between academic centers and community oncology centers. In other words, if you go to a high-powered academic center, is your outcome going to be better than if you go to a community oncology center? And I'm excited to see how that data is going to turn out, because the majority of patients don't live close to big academic centers.
What role would you say that individual physicians play in getting awareness out to other healthcare professionals about availability or the existence of some of these treatments so that they can become more involved in getting their governments to jump on board and maybe grease the wheels a bit for accessibility?
That's a good question, because physicians do have responsibility in doing that. Multiple myeloma is an extremely difficult disease. It's difficult to keep up on all the new treatments. And physicians do have responsibility not only to their patients, but to even help educate other physicians. Physicians need to humbly admit that they need continuing education. What they knew yesterday is not the same when it comes to multiple myeloma. So education, continuous education by physicians, by expert physicians, is just vital in this cancer.
Jim, where can we go online and get some more information about this study and about multiple myeloma in general?
There are many places to get multiple myeloma information online. 2 or 3 that I would mention would be the IMF, the International Myeloma Foundation, the MMRF, Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, a very good group called Myeloma Crowd is just full of information about myeloma. The Googling now can be so helpful, but you have to be careful about what sites you pick. Those 3 that I mentioned are really quite good.
Thank you for joining us here on Health Professional Radio. It's been a pleasure, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk again in the future.
Neil, I really appreciate your giving me this chance to highlight the trial. It's a great trial. It's so important for myeloma patients to have better knowledge about their treatments and their possibilities. And talking to you and your audience has given us that chance to spread that word, and I really appreciate it. So thanks so much.
Our pleasure. You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Transcripts and audio of this conversation with Mr. Jim Omel are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.